Today I have a special guest, Biju Mike, who is a fan of anime and who's very much into learning Japanese. And we're going to talk about this. He's a YouTuber, a very popular YouTuber. We're going to talk about all of these subjects, and I think it'll be quite interesting and different from my normal videos. Hello, Mike. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, my name is Mike, and I've been a huge fan of anime since I was a little kid, pretty much. And for a lot of people, that is what gets people interested in learning Japanese, because mainly you just want to be able to read things like manga in Japanese, or you want to be able to watch anime without having to rely on subtitles. I mean, it was probably more of an issue back in the day before, it was so widespread, when it was harder to obtain like subtitles and dubs and things like that. But it's still something that really interests me and just got me into language learning in general. Yeah.
As someone who knows practically nothing about anime, can you tell me a little bit about anime and the kinds of things that you talk about on your YouTube channel? And of course, tell our listeners where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube. Just search in BG Mike, or I don't know if you have a link down in the description. But yeah, I mean, it's such a unique name that even if you misspell it, you'll probably still find me. Yeah, when I started YouTube, I would talk a lot about anime, but now I pretty much just play games. Sometimes I do like anime related games, and I do make references to anime. Like people, because of my background, people know that I like anime. So it's just kind of a part of who I am, but I just do a lot of videos, mostly playing games online and doing reactions to stuff, just giving my opinions on stuff like that. So that's what I do.
Since I know nothing about anime, so anime, typically, my understanding is like a story where you have these cartoon figures that follow a certain style. And how does that connect with games?
A lot of things come out of Japan, like, games, Japanese games, anime, and things like that. And it has this certain aesthetic and style that is just a lot different from, like, you would say something like Spider-Man, or, if you were just compared to like a popular cartoon, it's completely a different vibe, I guess you would say. And it just, from a little kid, it got me really interested. And that's how I made pretty much all of my friends, because we all grew up watching Dragon Ball together, which Dragon Ball is super popular. Yeah.
I'm completely unaware of all of that.
I'm surprised that you haven't heard of Dragon Ball.
But it's certainly a major phenomenon.
Oh, yeah.
And I think a lot of people who become interested in learning Japanese and who become quite proficient in Japanese, they attribute that to their interest in anime. And so that was also your case. And how do you migrate from anime to learning Japanese?
I mean, I wish I could say I had a great reason. I don't. Like, there wasn't a need. Like, it's not like I have to learn Japanese to survive or anything like that. But I just found it really interesting. I pretty much just one day, it was probably around maybe 2018 or 2019, I started learning like hiragana and katakana, and I picked up one of the Genki books, and I just thought it was really interesting. Then I started doing some research about it, and I just thought it would be generally cool to be able to watch anime without having to rely on subtitles and also read in Japanese. I just thought the idea was really cool, and it got me interested. And now I actually just love the process of language learning. It feels like you're unlocking like a new part of the world.
I couldn't agree with you more. And what's interesting is that many people think, I want to learn this language because I'm going to go to Japan, or because I want to speak well, or I want to pass my exam. And those motivations are not that long lasting, really. Whereas whether it be anime, or in my case, I'm interested in history, for example. So you're driven by this interest in some content that you want to watch or listen to or read. And it's through engaging with that content and acquiring words and acquiring new habits in the brain that you start to get better and better at that language, not because you attend class. So I'm just curious, you've been learning Japanese largely on your own, or have you been also attending class?
So no, it's pretty much mostly on my own. Recently I started taking some tutoring lessons, well, not tutoring lessons, but I've been having, it's like slash tutoring slash just talking with a Japanese teacher. When I first started, I used the Genki textbook a little bit, but then I started finding like your videos and things like that, and it's a long story. I could get into it, but on my own, basically, is the answer to your question, is I've been doing it mostly on my own.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also use tutors primarily just to talk to, and particularly after I've reached a certain level in the language where we can actually have a conversation. And any of the the sort of grammatical explanations, if you don't have enough of a sort of level of experience and exposure to the language, it becomes an obstacle. When you have the grammar, trying to figure out, understand and stuff. Whereas if you have enough already of exposure to the language because of your interest in something like anime or history, then later on, these explanations actually start to help you. But up front, they're more of a hindrance than anything else. And whether you're driven by anime or history, it really doesn't matter. It's that process. But a lot of people will say, okay, so you like, I say I like listening and reading. And people say, well, how can you listen and read when you don't understand? And how can you read if it's written in a strange script? And of course, Japanese has a big sort of obstacle in that it combines Chinese characters, which are difficult in themselves, and it has two phonetic scripts, which are not really alphabets, but are syllabaries. So how did you deal with the obstacle of the Japanese writing system?
How do I deal with it? Well,
how did you deal with it initially? Once you get over the hurdle, you're getting better and better all the time. But
I wouldn't say I'm fluent I'm not close, but definitely how I dealt with it is, well, I just learned hiragana and katakana first. And really, I just feel like most of it is just getting used to it.
Right.
Because at first it's like you're so slow with reading and things like that. I started with Anki. I'm sure you're aware of Anki. Yeah. So like when it comes to learning Japanese, Anki is always talked about. And, I came across people like Matt versus Japan. And so I kind of went that method. But I also saw your videos at the same time. And at first I didn't understand LingQ, too much. I started dabbling in it like in around 2019. And, I always watch your videos saying that you just need a lot of listening and a lot of reading. So I did Anki for probably a few years. I didn't do it for like maybe 30 minutes a day or something like that. I thought for some reason I would get good if I did that. Not very much time, but around 2023, I decided to go full in on LingQ. And that's when it started clicking for me. Like lots of input, lots of reading and listening is like the key. And I was able to pick up words. And that's, I wanted to ask you kind of the same question, how to get over like kanji and stuff like that, like what your opinion on that was.
So first of all, I follow the same path as you. You first have to get the audio in you, and you have to use some form of phonetic script, which could be, say, in the case of Chinese pinyin, because they don't really have a separate phonetic script. In the case of Japanese, you do have the kana, the hiragana, katakana. So I've never used the romaji. I think that's a distraction.
Oh, yeah, neither.
So you just have to fight through it and get used to the kana, which is a phonetic script. Now, insofar as the characters, the kanji, I had a big advantage because I knew most of the characters from Chinese. And even if the form and the meaning is sometimes different in Japanese, having the Chinese kanji behind me was a major advantage. If you are starting with Japanese, so you don't have the kanji, you just have to grin and bear it. It's a separate learning activity, to my mind. You devote a half an hour or whatever it is a day to going over those characters. Either you just go through them and write them, and I find writing by hand is very helpful, but I know that my son used Heisik, I think it is, some system, so you can also find some system to learn the characters, but you have to treat the learning of the characters as a parallel stream, in my opinion, and then you gradually blend that into your listening and reading, and the more characters you have, the easier it is to use a system like LingQ. We do have the romaji at LingQ. We have the furigana at LingQ. Sometimes it's wrong. It's fine. Nothing's perfect in this world. And so as you continue reading and listening and using LingQ and continuing your parallel stream with the kanji, you get to 500 to 1,000 to 1,500. Gradually, they sort of come together and you're able to read better and better. But it's always a struggle. It's always easier to read in your own alphabet. Even if you understand, like I'm finding now with Arabic and Persian, I understand the alphabet. I know how it's supposed to work. But for the brain actually to get used to that writing system takes a long time. So it's going to be a struggle. It will remain a struggle. But at the same time, your listening comprehension continues to improve.
Yeah. So when it comes to kanji, I don't know if I'm just weird or maybe I'm doing this in a weird way. But so when I originally started learning Japanese, I did get like an Anki deck based off of remembering the kanji by Heisig that you explained. And so I was studying them like individually. I never wrote them, even though I know that would have helped me, but I was just lazy and I was like, I don't think I'm going to write. So I just never did it. So I kind of got a grasp on kanji, but, and I would do other things. I would use other websites that had flashcards that kind of taught you how to do, I don't know if you've ever heard of Wanikani, but it's a website that teaches you kanji and things like that. Like that helps me. But when I started moving to LingQ, I kind of don't learn kanji anymore. I learn them through words. Like if I see a word enough, I'll just remember how to say it. Like that's even with the kanji.
Right.
And I don't know if a lot of people don't talk about that, but I learned through basically vocabulary, the kanji. If that
I think that's absolutely true.
yeah.
And in my case, when I was doing Chinese, I very deliberately learned the first 1,000 characters. I had actual flashcards, real paper flashcards. But I got up to 3,000 or 4,000 characters, and so I didn't use those flashcards for the remaining 2,000, 3,000 characters. Because in fact, you get used to the pattern. There is a pattern in the characters. There's a pattern in everything. There's even a pattern to English spelling.
Yes.
Everything has a pattern. And after a while, you get used to these. And so it becomes easier and easier to remember new characters that you meet because there are familiar components. And so I think you have to put an initial effort into learning 1,000 or so characters. And then after a while, just through listening and reading and practice, your brain gets used to the pattern and it becomes easier to remember the new characters.
That has been my case. I was struggling to try to remember like the individual characters and stuff like that. But eventually I just realized, if you're putting in 3 hours of reading a day or something like which I've done, eventually you're like, wait, I know that word. Like I just know it because I've looked it up and I've seen it so many times that it just becomes natural to you. And I realized that that's all you really need, at least for me.
See, I think there's the fallacy of traditional language instruction is that you can deliberately learn something, that there's a direct relationship with your deliberate effort and what you end up being able to remember and use or recall. It's not that way. I have no idea of what's sticking and what isn't sticking, what I remembered today and will forget tomorrow. It all happens naturally if I expose myself enough to the language, either reading or listening, and eventually using it.
Yeah.
So to that extent, deliberately trying to remember it leads to frustration because I studied this, I did this list yesterday, and now it's all poof, it's gone. Forget it. It doesn't matter. Just keep going. So that's my approach.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this question to you. Like, do you think that do you think language is mostly a time, like just how much time you devote to it? Because I feel like anything, if you devote enough time to it, you just get used to it eventually, and I feel like that's been my experience is like the more time I put into it, like you have no choice but to remember because you see something so much.
I think there was this famous Hungarian polyglot, Lom Kato, who had a sort of a formula. And so you had time and attitude over any obstacle, any inhibition, any frustration. So time is obviously a big factor, but there's also whether you are uptight, whether you enjoy what you're doing, whether you enjoy the language, whether you're confident you can learn it, whether you just relax and do it. So if you put in the time and you're very interested, for example, in anime, and you're relaxed about it, and you don't worry about what you forget or what you don't understand, then there's no resistance. So that the positive energy and the time is really working for you. On the other hand, if you put in the time doing useless quizzes and drills and trying to read grammar explanations and you're sort of pushing on a rope, then you're reducing the efficiency of that time. So you've got to grease the skids by being very positive, not questioning yourself, being motivated, being interested. And there is a sort of a sense of, I did a video about, novelty and how new things. In other words, if you're positive about something, there is this sort of dopamine kick in anticipation of, and even while you're learning, which increases your focus, increases your ability to remember. So all of these things, as well as the time, are important.
I totally agree. Like, for me, what keeps me going is like just learning new words, just knowing something that I didn't know, yesterday, or being able to hear Japanese. And it's like, wait, no, I understood that. And especially with LingQ, being able to look back at a lesson and see that, like, I remember looking at this lesson, I knew nothing. It was like, 100% unknown words. And to see that it's only like, 5 or 10% now, like that's very, very motivating for me.
Similar with me. Like I'm looking at pages of Persian that are mostly white.
Yeah.
And very difficult content. Whereas when I started, it was all blue, it was all unknown. And that gives you a sense of achievement, which, again, sort of just further powers your motivation. But let me ask you then, if you say, okay, I learned something, I understand something, and the next day you hit a text where you forget a bunch of stuff, yellow words that you have saved, they're yellow, but now you don't know what they mean, or they're the same sections of a text, even in sentence mode, that you don't understand when you hear it. Does that frustrate you or does it demotivate you?
So this entire time I've been watching your channel, so I've been taking your advice of just forgetting is natural, right?
Right.
And no, it's very true, especially if you take a break. Like pretty soon, I'm actually going to take a 2 week trip to Japan, and I know that my Japanese, even though I'm going to be in Japan, is going to get a little bit worse because I'm not going to be reading the words that I'm reading every day. But no, it is a little frustrating, but nothing too bad. I know that it's definitely natural to forget.
The other thing too is if you go to Japan and you spend less time listening and reading and adding to your vocabulary and stuff, that shouldn't frustrate you, because the fact of being in that genuine Japanese cultural environment is going to improve your motivation, attitude. There's a lot of exposure that's happening, even though it's not deliberate. And you'll come back and very quickly you'll be better than ever.
Yeah. So I used to use Anki, right, a lot. And I felt like when I was doing that approach, like I felt like I was only doing Anki and doing flashcards, which like that did help me and it gave me a base. But when I got frustrated with the burnout of how many flashcards, like when you have hundreds of flashcards to do every day, it just like, I felt like that's all I was doing. And I was like, this isn't fun. You know, that was my, my experience, even though like you're supposed to immerse and do flashcards, but I feel like I was mostly using the little time I had to do flashcards. So in 2023, when I switched to LingQ, it gave me that feeling that I am immersing the entire time instead of just like relying on doing only flashcards.
Yeah. And if you've watched the last couple of videos I've done, there is research that shows that repetition is not as important as seeing vocabulary items in meaningful context, that the brain has a better chance because you're not getting multiple inputs, if you want, into the word, which words is used with that word. You're developing habits. You can't just deal with words in isolation, even in an Anki deck. Not only is it boring, it's doing the same thing over and over again, but according to the sort of MRI imaging, it's less effective than, even if it's somehow optimized. This is, not everyone agrees with me, but optimized according to some algorithm that you're supposed to, when you're about to forget it, you see it again and all this other stuff. In reality, there's so many words there that are isolated from any meaningful context that it's a bit frustrating and boring. And second of all, apparently not as effective. So, but people are going to do what they like to do. People who like to do Anki are going to do Anki, and they'll probably benefit from it. So I think people have to choose the path that works best for them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say my mistake that I made with Anki, not that it did help a little bit, but my main problem is I was mostly, because like I'm a full-time YouTuber and that's what I focus on. And, again, like learning Japanese is not a necessity. It's just something I really want to do, but it's not a necessity. It doesn't help my YouTube channel at all or anything like that. So I was using the little time that I had just to do Anki. And so it just felt kind of like isolating, and it gave me the sense that I was learning, but I wasn't like, watching tons of Japanese TV and stuff like that. Like I was just making flashcards, but I wasn't doing that. But for me, in 2023 was the breakthrough. I've been watching your videos, and at that point, I kind of didn't believe in LingQ. So what I did is I just forced myself to read this. There's these things called visual novels, which they're basically just stories, but they're with pictures, and it's almost like a video game, but it's mostly just reading like a book, and then there's characters on it, like pictures of characters. Basically, it's a weird thing, but it has a lot of voice with a lot of the text too. So what I did is I found an easy, short visual novel, and I went through the entire thing on LingQ. And by the time I was done with that, like it changed my opinion completely on LingQ. And then that's when I went full on that. And every time I go back to Japan, I'm able to read signs on the trains now, and I wasn't able to do that before. So it's like really cool to see that.
Absolutely. We're very similar. My interests are different than yours, but you said something quite interesting. You said very often we have the impression that we're learning, but in fact, we're not learning.
Yeah.
And we really don't know when we're learning. We think, okay, we studied this grammar explanation, or we studied this conjugation table in some other language. We think we learned something. In fact, maybe we didn't learn something. And you went through your visual novel because you're interested in it, not because you're deliberately learning, but in fact, you're learning better. So again, it's only after a while, say using LingQ, for example, or reading it, you realize just how much you've achieved, even though while you were doing it, you didn't have that impression that I'm learning something. And I think that gets back to my sort of Zen, effortless, the best craftsman is someone who effortlessly, whatever he does, if he's a carpenter or if he's a butcher, and you just got to naturally do it, and I think the results speak for themselves. Listen, we're so much in tune with how we approach language learning. We could go on forever. I don't know if you have any other questions.
So you've been using LingQ since the beginning. So what did you do before LingQ? I know that you are technically a co-creator, I believe.
Yeah. Co-creator, not in any technical sense, since my son Mark and his team look after the technical side of things. But before LingQ, I learned a bunch of languages, but always on the same principles. In other words, comprehension, vocabulary, accumulation through lots of listening and reading. And then you start speaking. And if you have more opportunity to speak, you'll do better eventually, although you'll stumble at first. Of course, I lived in France for 3 years as a student and then had to learn Mandarin Chinese. I was in Japan and constantly listening. Get in my car in the summer, it's 35 degrees Celsius, like getting into a furnace.
Yeah.
But I'd be listening to Japanese all the time. So the principles of learning are the same. The motivation for Link was the idea that I had a bunch of books here, for example, with a whole bunch of words underlined that I wanted then to learn. I'd look them up in the dictionary and I'd forget them. And I realized with the advent of the internet and MP3 files and online dictionaries and all of the functionality you can build into something, that there was a lot better way than trying to, just read and say words. Prior to that, I would rely too, in all of my languages, I would try to rely on readers where you had a vocabulary behind each chapter. And that's when I also realized that you want that vocabulary, that glossary, as close as possible to what you're reading. Because any glossary that's at the back of the book is useless. It's too far removed from what you're reading. Any review of vocabulary has to be as close as possible to what it is you're reading, because the purpose of the glossary is not that you're going to memorize the glossary. It's going to help you get through the text, because the learning takes place because you're getting through the text. So a lot of the principles of learning that are embodied in Link basically reflect my experience as a language learner with, readers, with glossaries, with struggling to remember vocabulary. At a time when the audio was not so readily available, there was no YouTube. They had these open reel tape recorders and whatnot. Principles were the same, but the technology is so much better today.
Yeah, I just realized that Link is 20 years old now.
Amazing.
So you've used it since the beginning. But I find that really interesting. So when you learned your first language, did you what was your first language? French, I'm assuming?
To learn.
Yeah, I mean, we grew up in Montreal in those days was very much, a million English speakers, 2 million French speakers, not too much connection between the two. Today, that's not the case. Montreal is quite bilingual. But the first language that I sort of determined I want to learn this language to a level of fluency was French. And so I ended up doing a lot of reading and listening, watching French movies, much like you with anime. Then I ended up going to France and studying there for 3 years. Then the second one was Mandarin Chinese, because I was working for the Canadian government. They sent me to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin. But I carried the same practices. One big advantage of learning Japanese and Chinese is that, to me, although other people disagree, they are not grammar-intensive languages like Russian or the Romance languages or Arabic. So you have to get used to the patterns. And so if you get used to thinking in terms of patterns of the language rather than grammar rules, which is the way I approach Chinese and Japanese, they say it this way. I don't want to see an verb, noun, subject, verb, not. I don't want to see any of that stuff. I just want to, this is what we say in English. This is what they say in Japanese. So I wanted to get used to the patterns of the language. And I think that I carried that forward. And my initial motivation to learn Russian was that I felt I could do the same thing with a Slavic language, which is very, grammatically complicated, which to my mind, Japanese and Chinese are not. Yeah, that's how I approach it. Always a lot of input. This is long before I ever heard of Stephen Krashen.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I noticed that, like, before, when I would try to follow textbooks or try to learn grammar on their own, when I know nothing, it's challenging. But like when I started reading a lot on Link and stuff like that, when I actually go to look up grammar, I'm like, wait, I've seen this like a million times. And then all of a sudden it's easy to remember.
Well, I liken it to, I remember I was once in a German town and I asked someone there how to get to somewhere, the post office. And being German, of course, he gave me a tremendously thorough explanation of how to get there, But as soon as I walked away from that person, I'd completely forgotten what he said.
Of course, not.
If, on the other hand, I knew that tree, the bank, the this, the that, if I had some background, some point of reference, then all of those instructions would start to make sense. But if I don't have a point of reference, then all the grammar explanations actually don't do much for you. So the first thing is, as difficult as it is, get the words in you, get the patterns in you, get some familiarity with the language, and then you can always go back later on, particularly if you're curious about why does it go this way, you can look up the explanation if it helps you, if you even remember it. But at any rate, it has to start with exposure to the language.
Yeah, that's why my conclusion that I've come up with, just like, I'm not close to being fluent or anything, but I try to put as much time as I possibly can. It's another question I wanted to ask you about, but basically, yeah, I just feel like that's what language learning is. It's just mostly about getting used to it rather than just trying to struggle to learn it. It's just, acquiring and,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, the more mistakes you make. You have to make mistakes. And the more mistakes you make, the more you're going to improve. And I also put out we have a new prime minister in Canada, and one of the knocks on him is that he doesn't speak French very well, which I don't agree with. But of course, being politics, the opposition is going to criticize him for not speaking French, as well as their leader, right? So I said, no. He communicates. He understands. He communicates. He communicates. He has a nice cadence. He is comfortable in the language. He is pleasant to listen to. He communicates. That's all you need. It's not like Olympic diving. We shouldn't be sort of giving in 9 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. So the whole emphasis in language output that somehow you're going to be judged by how well you pronounce or how accurate your grammar, none of that matters. What matters is how well does that person communicate.
Yeah.
And I've done so much business with people from non-English speaking countries, from Europe, from Asia, whatever. And if they communicate well with mistakes, with patterns that come from their own language, with pronunciation that reflects their own language, but they communicate well, use words to get their thoughts across. We don't need to be perfect in the language, but you said you had a few more questions.
On LingQ, what is your most studied language? Because I think in one video I saw your Korean. If I remember correctly, it was something in the 40,000 known words or something like that.
Well, I would think probably in terms of, it depends what we look at, but words, read words, known words would be Russian. Russian, Czech, and then we have a bunch of them at 40,000, including Korean and yeah.
Yeah, no, that blew me away because I'm barely at 20,000, and of course, we both know that doesn't mean you actually know that many words, but I still thought that was pretty mind blowing. I was like, wow, like that's crazy.
Yeah, you got to be careful because it's often the same word in different forms.
Exactly, yeah.
And this multiplying effect is bigger in some languages than others, so it's not comparable, but nevertheless, it is encouraging. Whenever I say I'm nowhere in Korean, and then I look, actually, my passive knowledge is not that bad because I have 40,000 known words.
Yeah, no. Like, I'm trying to think what's a good number for like a language. Like, if you were just to say in general how many known words a person would have before they were like fluent when it comes to using LingQ, I just wonder what that number would be in certain languages. Like, I was thinking maybe more around like 50,000, like for Japanese or something. I don't know.
I think it's 50,000 is getting close to it. It depends.
Yeah.
On what else you're doing. Like you've still got to do a lot. You have to have earned those words through lots of listening and reading.
Yeah.
If you speak more, you'll be better. So it's almost like your potential in the language, but it's also different with, like, I have 30,000 known words in Arabic and 16,000 in Persian, and I'm much better in Persian than Arabic because of the way the language is structured. So you can't really compare between languages, but it's a high number.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, it's higher than people think. You often hear this, if I know 1,000 words, I'll be fluent. No, you won't be.
That's the thing I couldn't get through my head too, is like you just realize like how much of a long journey it is to get to that point. And I realized, like, for me personally, I probably spent around, well, in LingQ it says I have 1,500 hours. So I would say probably altogether is probably between 2,000 to 3,000 hours I probably have in Japanese in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure I probably need to spend closer to 10,000 hours, but I enjoy it.
Well, that's what I always say. Like, don't try and, how fast can I learn?
Yeah.
How long will it take me and stuff? Learn to enjoy it. Like, how many, any activity that you enjoy, why do you want it to end? So.
Of course. I don't know. I don't know when the day would come that I would even stop like using LingQ. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but I do enjoy it.
Well, listen, we should end it here. I just want to say, Mike, it's been a very enjoyable conversation. You have an attitude that's very similar to mine, one of exploration, enjoyment, taking advantage of every opportunity to learn things, to improve. So it's very encouraging to me that you enjoy using LingQ. And so I want to thank you very much for having this conversation, and remind our listeners again, whatever you want to tell our listeners about your activity on YouTube.
Well, okay, so you can find me at BG Mike at Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. If you just type that in, nobody else will be named that, so you'll find me. I also recently started a language learning channel called Mike Learns Japanese, and that's where I've talked about LingQ on there because I realized not a lot of people talk about LingQ when it comes to learning Japanese specifically. Right. So I talk about it on there. So if you're interested, check it out.
People, check it out. And Mike, thank you very much again.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.